We continue part 3 of the slides by looking at how the substitution and income effects can be applied to 3 various cases. That pertains to figure 4.6, 4.7, and 4.8. And that is a normal good, inferior good, and a special case called a Griffin good, respectively. Now, in figure 4.6, we begin by analyzing the income and substitution effects when there is a decrease in the price of food. So this scenario is for a normal good. So on our vertical axis, we still have clothing, and on our horizontal axis, we have food. And the first budget line is given by this blue line, RS. So this is, of course, for a particular income and price for food and clothing. Now, remember, this scenario is where there is a decrease in the price of food. Now, we know when there's a decrease in the price of food, with clothing's price remaining the same and the income level also remaining the same, the budget constraint is going to pivot outward and it now becomes RT. So bear that in mind. Where the price of food falls, the budget constraint pivots outward. So let's just get some additional information for us to continue. Now, on the first budget line, before the price of food changes, right? We have RS, that is our budget line. The consumer maximizes utility with a combination of food and clothing at point A. So at point A, that is on the indifference curve U1, that is the point where the indifference curve is tangent to RS at one point. Okay, so for that, the clothing units is C1 and food units is F1. Right now, the price falls of food, and like I said, the budget constraint is going to pivot outward and become RT. Now, the consumer is going to be able to achieve a higher level of utility given by the indifference curve U2 at point B. So we can see that point B by revealed preference is going to be preferred to A because the consumer could have chosen A but now prefers point B, as this basket is going to yield a higher level of utility or satisfaction. So now the combination of clothing is C2 and food is F2. So now the consumer's purchasing power has essentially increased because the price of food has fallen. So now they're able to get more food and clothing, as we can see. Or there's been sort of a rearranging in terms of what that combination of clothing and food would be. Now, how do we go about explaining that change from basket A on utility curve or indifference curve U1 to basket B on indifference curve U2? Now, this consumer's consumption has essentially increased from F1 to F2. This is the total effect. The consumer's consumption, you can see, has increased by that region. See the distance between A and B. Now, that effect, that total effect, can be broken down into two effects, namely the substitution effect and the income effect. So the substitution effect is given by F1E, that distance over there, and it's associated with a move from A to D. And that is as a result of changes in relative prices of food and clothing, but it keeps real income or satisfaction utility constant. And then the income effect is given from E to F2. That is a movement from D to B, keeping relative prices constant, but there's increases in purchasing power. So let's explain those two points. So recall that the substitution effect is the change in consumption of a good. In this case, the change in consumption is food, given the change in price of food, while utility is constant. So food is now relatively cheaper than clothing. So the consumer consumed more food now, as seen in that movement from F1 to E. So we can see the consumer has consumed more food when this movement along that curve took place. Now remember, utility or satisfaction, according to the substitution effect, is to remain unchanged. So we can see that this consumer is still on U1. So this consumer is still on the same indifference curve. So that move to D over there from A to D, which represents that substitution effect, arose because food was relatively cheaper. So whereas at A, the consumer had OF food consumed, at D, the consumer now consumes OE worth of units of food. So, how did we get to this point? If you were given a scenario and needed to construct a diagram like this, could you break down these effects? So, to get to point D, what we need to do is we need to draw an imaginary budget line which is parallel to RT. Remember, RT is the new budget line. So RT has a new slope reflecting the change in the price, in the relative prices. Now, since the imaginary budget line is parallel to RT, this will also reflect the change in relative prices. Now, to find the point where the imaginary budget line is tangent to U1, that is at point D. So all we needed to do is determine where our indifference curve U1 is tangent to this new or imaginary budget line. So remember, by doing so, utility is remaining constant, but the relative prices has changed. And that will give us our substitution effect. Now, the income effect, I said, was that move from D to B. And we can show it by the effect of EF2. So the income effect shows the change in consumption because the consumer now has a greater purchasing power. So hence, from the previous slides, it was stated that that change in purchasing power would be reflected by a movement to a new indifference curve. Hence, you can see moving from D to B, it moves us to a new indifference curve. So now the consumer is able to increase the consumption of food. We can see that the consumption of food has increased from OE to OF2. And hence, since food is a normal good, we can see that this income effect is positive, right? With income increasing, the consumption of food has increased. Therefore, it implies food is a normal good because the income effect is positive. So with the income effect, remember it states that relative prices are kept constant and point D and point B both lie on budget lines that are parallel. We can see this imaginary budget line is parallel to that new budget line when the price of food fell. So therefore, relative prices are constant, but point B is chosen on U2, which is a higher indifference curve. And that shows us that this change must have come about as a result of a change in purchasing power. Thus, the total effect is going to be the sum of the income effect and the substitution effect. So that is F1E plus EF2, and that gives you the total effect as F1, F2. That was a thorough analysis of a normal good situation. You could be asked to do the same for an inferior good or a special case of a Griffin good. Now, it is important to take note that the substitution effect is always the same. So, if the price falls, there will be an increase in consumption. But the income effect can be positive or negative, so move in any direction. It depends on the nature of the good. Remember that for an inferior good, if income increases, consumption of that good falls if it's inferior. So an inferior good has a negative income effect, as we will see now in figure 4.7. Now, in this figure, we're still dealing with clothing and food on the respective axes, and you have your budget constraint RS given for particular income and the prices of the goods. So the consumer is initially at A on budget line RS. Now, if the price of food were to fall, we know the budget line would pivot outwards and become RT. And with the decrease in the price, the consumer now moves to point B. That becomes the optimal bundle of clothing and food, or the utility maximizing bundle. Now, the total effect is thus given by the movement from A to B. That is the total effect. But we can break down this total effect by looking at what the substitution effect was and the income effect. And because this good is an inferior good, we can see this income effect is negative. So let's break it down. So the resulting change in food purchased can be broken down into the substitution effect being F1E. So you're going to obtain it in the same way that you did previously, where you draw a budget line, an imaginary budget line, parallel to your new budget line, such that you can see the relative prices differing between points A and point D. So moving along this indifference curve U1, utility remains the same, but at this point where U1 is tangent to this new budget constraint, the imaginary one, that reflects the relative prices now being different. As a result of food becoming cheaper, the consumer purchases more food, and that is that movement from F1 to E. And the income effect now is negative, and that is a movement from E to F2. That portion from D to B or E to F2 represents an income effect. And that is brought about as a result of the consumer's increase in purchasing power. But because the good is an inferior good, the consumer now purchases less food, and with that freed up income, chooses to purchase more clothing instead. Thus, the total effect is going to be given by F1E plus EF2, which is negative, and that gives you a total effect of F1, F2. So we can see that the net effect now is still positive because our substitution effect was far bigger than our income effect. So even though there was decrease in the price of food, and in this scenario, food was an inferior good, it still led to an increase in the quantity of food demanded because the substitution effect outweighed the income effect. So hence your total effect was still positive. So lastly, we have to look at a special case of a Griffin good. Now, I'm going to have to stop this recording because of the time constraint and start a new one for just this particular slide.